People are always surprised by the fact that I have lowering springs on my autocross Mustangs instead of coilovers. I've used Ford Performance M-5300-C lowering springs, commonly referred to as C springs, on my 2000 GT and my 1992 GT. Between those two cars, I've put Ford Performance C springs to the test at over 160 autocross events. If you're trying to choose the best lowering springs for your 79 to 04 autocross Mustang, I recently posted a detailed video that covers the basics, benefits, and drawbacks of lowering springs. This video shares my honest autocross-tested review of the Ford Performance M5300C lowering springs. I'll cover their features and benefits, provide some install tips, and share my assessment of their quality, performance, and durability. This is not a paid promotion. Before you install lowering springs on your Mustang, make sure to check the SCCA rules. The Ford Performance C-Spring kit includes linear rate 650 pounds per inch front springs and progressive rate 200-300 pounds per inch rear springs. They fit 1979 to 2004 solid rear axle Mustangs. I confirmed with Ford Performance that these springs will fit V6 and 4-cylinder Mustangs, but I learned they were never tested on anything but V8 cars. They come with a shiny black finish. Ford Performance C-Springs improve your Mustang's handling by lowering the center of gravity and reducing body roll when cornering, nosedive under heavy braking, and squatting during aggressive acceleration. According to Ford, these springs will drop a 1979 to 1993 V8 Mustang 0.875 inches in the front and 0.5 inches in the rear. They'll lower a 1994 to 2004 V8 solid rear axle Mustang 1.125 inches in the front and 0.75 inches in the rear. They do point out that the height on some vehicles will vary. Keep in mind that not all 79 to 04 solid rear axle Mustangs left the factory at the exact same weight. Depending on the year and trim level, lowering springs can drop the car more or less. If you're modifying your Mustang, adding weight to the chassis or removing weight from the chassis will impact ride height. The Ford C-Springs don't come with instructions. Installing lowering springs is a little more difficult than the average project because there is some danger involved. If you're not careful, springs can fly out and injure you. Always follow proper safety protocols or have a professional mechanic do the work. You might need an internal spring compressor to remove the OEM front springs. This spring installation tool from Maximum Motorsports makes installing front lowering springs in a Fox body Mustang with stock A-arms much easier. But it doesn't work with 1984 to 1986 SVO Mustang A-arms. The tool will also work on SN95 Mustangs with stock A-arms. It can be helpful to use electrical tape to hold the upper front spring isolators in place. Spraying a little glass cleaner into polyurethane lower front isolators will make it easier to slide them onto the springs. OEM A-arms have two holes in the spring cup. When installing the front springs, make sure you don't cover this hole, but you should cover this hole. When installing the rear springs, make sure the pigtail on the lower control arm is at the rear of the car and pointing toward the left side of the car. Every time I've installed the rear C-springs with aftermarket control arms, I've been able to get the springs in place with all of the rear control arms in the car. With the shocks out, jack up on the opposite side of the axle, push down on the side you're working on, and the spring should go in. It took about 4.5 hours to install the C-springs on my cars. You will need an alignment after installing the springs. It's worth mentioning that in the past, I was able to get my 1992 GT and my 2000 GT aligned to the factory specs without aftermarket caster camber plates. But that might not be the case for every Mustang. I did not need to use a shorter pinion snubber. Anytime you ask someone to review their lowering springs, it's important to know how much their car weighs and what other mods they've made to their suspension. I autocrossed my 1992 GT at 3,220 pounds and 3,080 pounds. Those weights are without the 185-pound driver. My Fox has subframe connectors, a K-member brace, a strut tower brace, and a rear shock tower brace. It has adjustable shocks and struts, caster camber plates, a 1 3/8 inch front sway bar, and a Steeda adjustable rear sway bar in addition to a 23mm rear sway bar. It has Steeda aluminum rear, upper, and lower control arms. During its time as an autocross car, it's had a mix of poly, Delrin, and spherical suspension bushings. I used poly spring isolators front and rear, and I added Steeda spring spacers up front. Before the IRS swap, I autocrossed my 2000 GT at approximately 3,400 pounds, without the driver. I did change some suspension parts during my first couple of seasons, but for the vast majority of the runs with the C-springs, my SN95 had subframe connectors, a custom brace added to the OEM convertible K-member X brace, a strut tower brace, and a rear shock tower brace. It had upgraded front struts and adjustable rear shocks, a 35mm front sway bar, and a Steeda adjustable rear sway bar in addition to the OEM rear sway bar. It had Steeda steel rear, upper, and lower control arms and poly suspension bushings. I used poly spring isolators front and rear. Both cars had the weak links taken out of the suspension and a good amount of adjustability. With the Ford Performance C-springs on those warhorses, I did over 650 autocross runs. The springs saw action in countless slaloms, sweepers, Chicago boxes, and lane changes, on surfaces ranging from a rough retired airport runway to well-worn large and small parking lots to a smooth racetrack. So what do I think of the Ford Performance M-5300-C springs? I've purchased 3 sets of C-springs in the last 30 years. The quality has been consistent. They are well made, and the finish is uniform. When it comes to performance, I think Ford absolutely nailed it with these springs. The spring rates and the combination of linear front springs and progressive rear springs are perfectly suited for these cars. They've worked well on both of my Mustangs despite a big difference in weight. The linear rate front springs are really predictable. That helps me attack with confidence. I've driven a lot of solid rear axle 79-04 Mustangs with similar suspension mods that used linear rate rear springs. The rear end of my solid rear axle cars always felt a bit more composed. I was able to roll on the throttle a little earlier coming out of corners. Working with my other suspension mods as part of a system, the C-springs helped my cars feel planted and present. The reduced body roll, pitching, and squatting makes them feel more collected on course. Having said that, on very rough surfaces, my cars felt a bit bouncy. At a couple of events, it was hard to attack at 100%, even after softening my shocks or struts. That wasn't a common occurrence, but I always advise people to consider the surfaces they compete on when choosing lowering springs. The C-springs did lower the front of my 1992 GT a little more than I like for an autocross car, even with poly isolators. Installing Steeda spring spacers solved that problem. I've had the same set of C-springs on my 1992 GT for 30 years. There are some chips in the finish and a little surface rust, but overall the finish still looks very good. On both of my cars, the C-springs held up extremely well under tough autocross conditions. I haven't experienced any decrease in performance over the years. The Ford Performance M-5300-C springs have been an integral part of my preferred solid rear axle Mustang autocross suspension setup. They are the lowering springs I recommend most often when I help people pick suspension parts. If the C-springs are the right choice for your 79 to 04 autocross Mustang, you can be sure you're getting quality springs that provide excellent performance.